and welcome. Hello, everybody, and welcome. We really appreciate you all joining us today. This is part of the Center for Land Use and Sustainability Climate Series, where we occasionally will host a speaker to talk about a climate-related issue, because the climate challenge, as many of you know, is probably the leading threat to humanity at this point. And I'm really, well, first of all, I'm Claire Jantz. I'm the director for the Center for Land Use and Sustainability and a professor in the Geography or Science department. And I am really pleased to introduce Dr. Karl Hausker, because it's not every day that we are able to host really an international specialist on mitigation and adaptation approaches to climate change. Dr. Hausker, just to give you a little bit of his background, he has a master's and a doctorate in public policy from the University of California out in Berkeley, and he has a bachelor's degree in economics from Cornell University. He has more than 3 decades of professional experience in the field of climate change, energy, and environment. He has worked in legislative fields, including working with the executive branch. He's worked at research institutions, NGOs, and in professional and private consulting. He has been involved in climate policy analysis and modeling projects for several federal agencies, including USAID, US EPA, and regionally the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which I'm pleased to say Pennsylvania recently joined into a Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, the Western Climate Initiative, and the California Air Resources Board. He has focused largely on energy and transportation and on low carbon development strategies. He is currently coming to us from the World Resources Institute, where he is a senior fellow on the WRI climate program. If you don't know much about the World Resources Institute, this is a resource organization, a global resource research organization that works with governments, businesses, and multilateral institutions, as well as civil society groups. They have a real practical focus on coming up with solutions that improve both people's lives and to protect the environment. They focus on 7 global challenges: food, forest, water, energy, climate, the ocean, and cities. And again, kind of bring a practical lens to these issues, focusing on business, economics, finance, as well as equity. So that is who we have coming to us today. And I'm very proud that Shippensburg University is able to host Dr. Hausker today. So I'll hand it over to you. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. Really a pleasure to be here. My second visit to campus. And also on a logistic note, I was warned that some of you have a 1 o'clock class. So we'll be in Q&A hopefully by 12:45, but if you need to filter out, I won't be insulted. Please get where you need to go. So getting to net zero, as many of you know, in the climate change arena, recently scientists and policymakers have realized that we really need not to just cut emissions, but by mid-century, get emissions all the way to zero on a net basis. There's a lot of challenges to that, but fortunately, we also have solutions. About 60 million years ago, the primary dominant species was in a similar situation. And someone was at a podium saying, the picture's pretty bleak, gentlemen, the world's climates are changing, the mammals are taking over, and we all have a brain about the size of a wallet. The dinosaurs went extinct. We're not going to go extinct. Yes, the climate is changing, and unfortunately, we caused it. But yes, the mammals took over, and now we're a pretty smart mammal with a brain much larger than a wallet, than a walnut. And we have the solutions largely in hand to solve this problem. So let's roll up our sleeves, no doom and gloom. Yes, there's challenges, but we can overcome them. What I'm going to talk about today is the net zero challenge. I'm going to lean a lot on the most recent report by the IPCC the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has new reports coming out, but on the mitigation side, still need to rely on a 2018 report. I'm going to talk about the 4 key strategies for getting to net zero emissions on a global basis: efficiency, electrification, zero carbon electricity, and carbon capture. Then I'm going to do kind of a deep dive on that zero carbon electricity and the role of renewables. And I'm going to talk about the obstacles to actually going to 100% renewables, which may be contrary to some of the things you read and hear. And I'll also give some credit to the dissenting view on that. The other thing I'll focus in on is carbon capture, either capturing CO2 emissions before they leave a source, or capturing carbon literally out of the atmosphere and reducing concentrations. I view this as an imperative, but I'm also going to give credit to a dissenting view. And throughout this, and one of my closing messages is, we need to address climate change as if we're at the Vegas betting tables. We need to spread our chips on multiple technologies. Any one of them could hit a dead end, a technical dead end, an economic dead end, or a political dead end. So the idea of putting all our chips, say, on just renewables to solve this, I think is a very risky strategy. I'm going to move pretty fast through some of this material, but you'll see there's web links at the bottom of each slide. I will share the PowerPoint with Shippensburg, and you can do a deeper dive on any of this. I'm going to be focusing mostly on carbon dioxide, although as many of you know, there are 5 other greenhouse gases. Each of them play a role, but in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on carbon dioxide. And you mentioned adaptation. Yes, there's a whole another part of the challenge. Some warming is baked in already. Some of the effects of warming we're already seeing. So yes, we need to make all of our human and natural systems more resilient and adapt to the climate change that is coming. Okay, I mentioned the IPCC report. The IPCC tries to synthesize all of our knowledge across different aspects of climate change. They release a report about every 7 or 8 years. It has 3 components: science, impacts, and mitigation. The new science report is out. Next year, we'll see the impacts and mitigation reports come out. But in the meantime, the best synthesis of how we do mitigation is a report that came out actually sort of off cycle in 2018, titled Global Warming of 1.5 Degrees. What are the pathways the globe can take to keep warming to 1.5 degrees? What does that report say? Yes, it's daunting. If you've seen the report, you remember the famous toboggan slide of what needs to happen to CO2 emissions. As a globe, we're at about 40 billion tons of CO2 per year. And that is obviously leading to increasing concentrations and warming. We need to reduce those emissions over the next 30 years all the way to 0 to have a chance of keeping warming at 1.5 degrees. To the extent we fail, we're going to hit 2 degrees. If we fail more, we're going to hit 2.5 and on and on. So emissions need to begin to decline quickly, reach net zero by mid-century. We are likely to overshoot safe concentrations that would keep us at 1.5. So we actually need to develop, very likely, negative emission approaches. Sucking CO2 literally out of the air, like I said, in a technological way, or through forests, trees, and perhaps some ocean-based approaches, literally take CO2 out of the atmosphere to get us to safe concentration levels by 2050 and beyond. The IPCC examined many pathways to do this, and the sort of spaghetti string of pathways you see there represent many modelers' approaches to this. The shaded blue areas are the ones that keep us 1.5. The shaded gray areas take us to 2.0, to 2 degrees. But as you can see, one of the most important features of this is beginning either before 2050 or after 2050, we will have a very significant challenge of literally finding ways to take CO2 out of the air. And you can see the P1, P2, P3, P4. It's either going to be taking out a little or taking out a lot. By the way, should I also say, if something I say makes no sense, throw up your hand for a quick clarifying question, and then we'll do big Q&A toward the end. How can we get on that path to rapidly decreasing emissions? Fortunately, there's quite a lot of consistency across global modeling and also national modeling on how to get there. I see consistency across IPCC reports, across reports of the IEA, the International Energy Association, IRENA, the International Renewables Agency, and then at the national level, there's a lot of very credible modeling done by a consulting firm called E3. Some of you may have heard of the Princeton Net America study that came out earlier this year. All of these are what I call mainstream modeling with very consistent results in terms of the basic strategies. I'm going to walk you through an example by Jim Williams and the Evolved Energy Research folks called Carbon Neutral Pathways for the US that came out earlier this year. The 4 strategies, I want to start with energy efficiency. Across all of our end uses, all of our sectors, we can reduce the amount of energy we use. In this model, applying existing technologies and some technologies almost ready for commercialization, in the US, we could take our current energy use of about 200 gigajoules a year per person, reduce that by a third, maybe more. That's strategy number 1. Strategy number 2 is to electrify as many end uses as possible, again, across the entire economy. And there's a lot of good news going on here. People know electric vehicles are beginning to take off. We know in our buildings how to switch from gas heating to electric heating for space, for water heating. We can cook with electricity instead of natural gas. All those are eminently doable. In industry, we can substitute electricity for some combustion of fossil fuel in many areas. We can also use electricity to produce hydrogen. We can split water molecules into hydrogen and oxygen. And so here you see a little check there of electric fuels is part of the whole electrification strategy, producing hydrogen, in some cases ammonia, which can fulfill some end uses that are hard to use electricity directly. So if we do this smartly, we can take electricity use from about 20% of our final energy use currently up to 60%, possibly even more. Those 2 strategies are widely embraced, and there's not too much controversy about those. If we do that, all that electrification, we better be sure that we take our emissions from producing electricity down to as close to 0 as possible. And that's the first strategy here. Right now, we use about 500, emit about 500 grams of CO2 for every kilowatt hour we produce. That has been decreasing lately, but we can take it down to near 0 by 2050. And we have lots of options for zero carbon electricity: solar, wind, hydro, geothermal, nuclear. We can burn fossil fuel or bioenergy with carbon capture technology, reduce the emissions by 95%, and in some cases, even 100%. We can produce hydrogen, burn it in a turbine, 0 emissions. So we have lots of options. The controversy about this option, as you can guess, is whether we should embrace all of those technologies or just embrace a few of those technologies. The 4th big strategy is capturing carbon. As I said, in some cases, we're going to need to capture carbon before it leaves an emission source. And in other cases, we're going to have to literally pull it out of the air because we put too much in. This can apply to power plants, to industrial sources that are burning fossil fuels, but also we have industrial processes that just emit CO2. The cement industry is a major emitter of CO2. And no matter how we make cement as we can envision it now, there are going to be CO2 emissions even if we're not burning fossil fuel in the production. So 4 key strategies: And this gives you, I'll go through this very quickly. It just gives you a sense of how this may play out in vehicles on the left-hand side. Here's our light-duty vehicles. Here's Tesla, Nissan Leaf coming in. We can switch to battery electric cars by 2050 with a nice S-curve. On medium and heavy-duty trucks, we can electrify some of them, but we may have to produce some hydrogen and use fuel cells because just the power to weight ratios are different in medium and heavy-duty trucks. And over on the residential building side, again, we already use a lot of electric resistance heating and heat pumps to heat our homes. We can phase out fuel oil and natural gas over time, and similar with water heating. Electricity generation and demand. We electrify all that. Let's look at the right-hand side here. What will happen to electricity demand? It could triple over the next 30 years, going from, say, about 4,000 terawatt hours up to 12,000 terawatt hours in this particular pathway modeling. And that's, the gray is a lot of electricity demand direct use, but also here's some industrial boilers switching to electricity. And here's electrolysis. Here's that use of electricity to produce hydrogen. So demand, if we're successful, will skyrocket. If you work for an electric utility, want a job with electric utility, you may be back in a big growth industry here. But how do we make that electricity? How can we squeeze the carbon out of it? And that's over on the left-hand side here. Again, we can combine these technologies in many different ways. We have wind and solar and geothermal and hydro and gas, coal, nuclear here. Here's where we are in 2020. Here's where we could be in 2050. You can see this study and most modeling studies foresee huge growth in wind in the light blue and yellow with solar photovoltaic. But note that they are still complemented by what we call clean, firm sources. Instead of the intermittency and the variability of solar and wind, which comes and goes, we need some clean, zero carbon electricity sources represented here by some nuclear output, and we have some gas actually without carbon capture here, and some hydro. So this is, again, a common, and I'm going to convince you very quickly with a couple slides, this kind of mixture, heavy solar and wind, but complemented by clean firm, is a mainstream modeling result. Boom, let's look at the latest IEA study, came out in 2050, net zero by 2050. They have solar and wind at about 68% of a global generation mix, complemented by nuclear, hydrogen, and carbon capture. Let's look at IRENA's latest study, 2019, the roadmap to 2050. They have solar and wind at about 60% of total generation, the 35 and the 25 here, complemented by hydro, some use of bioenergy, some nuclear, and some natural gas. If we went back to the 2018 report by the IPCC and we looked at these 4 illustrative pathways, we would find solar and wind ranging from 63 to 81% of total generation, complemented by those clean, firm sources of things like hydro and nuclear, gas with carbon capture, bioenergy. But wait a minute, why do we need all that other stuff? Aren't solar and wind now the cheapest source of energy? If you read the trade press, you'll see stories of renewables are winning the battle against coal and gas. Renewables are winning. They're cheaper than existing coal and nuclear. Solar plants are now cheaper than natural gas just about everywhere. This is true through one lens, but I want to emphasize a real important point that a lot of people in the environmental community still don't really get. The good news is that when you look at what's called the levelized cost of energy, the average cost of a megawatt hour produced from a standalone plant, a solar plant, a wind plant, we've had dramatic cost reductions over the last 10 years. The cost of wind from that standalone windmill has decreased roughly 70%. Solar photovoltaics by 90%. This is all good news. And this means that we can solve this problem much more cheaply than we thought 10 years ago. But remember, a grid that keeps the lights on 24/7, that electrifies everything, is not built by a single plant. It's by a grid. It's by a collection of power plants that interact with each other, and those power plants complement each other. And I call this the riddle of cheap renewables, but high system costs. There's a reason that if we try to build a system entirely with solar and wind, the costs are going to escalate. And this goes against a lot of advocacy groups that are saying 100% renewables. Corporations are saying, hey, we're buying 100% renewables. Universities, maybe Shippensburg is saying, maybe you're buying 100% renewables. And that's all good and stimulating the market. But we have to look at the entire grid system. And by the way, you can even buy Budweiser produced by 100% renewable. Not sure how that marketing campaign turned out, but they're with the ball game. So why would system costs increase if we tried to go all solar and wind? Well, solar and wind, as I said earlier, are variable. They are not firm. This graph from some modeling by Mark Jacobson out of Stanford shows the variability of solar over two 24-hour periods. The solar in green here, as you can probably guess, by sundown, solar output is 0. Wind, shown in the blue, is kind of very random, stochastic, can be all over the place. So that's one form of variability. Every day, you have to figure out what happens when the sun goes down and the wind doesn't blow. But there's also seasonal variability. This is Jacobson's modeling over a full 72 months, 6 years, showing that solar output is greatest in the summer. Duh, the sun is closer to the earth, the angle is better. Solar output varies by a factor of 2. It drops to less than half of that, or roughly half of that in the winter. Wind output varies tremendously over season, highest in the spring, lowest in the fall. And even if you combine these two together, the solar in green and the wind in blue, here's your total wind and solar output varying over seasons. It varies by a factor of about 50%, lowest in the fall and winter. So how would you deal with that variability season to season? And finally, my favorite German word, they have a word for everything. They make big, long words, Dunkelflaute. What happens when you just have random drops in wind and solar output that you might expect when they happen, but you can't predict which days or how long? 5 days, 10 days, full 2 weeks. This is an example of the Dunkelflaute in January of 2017, where German solar and wind output dropped dramatically, and they had to crank on the coal plants and the gas plants. So dealing with that variability is what solves the riddle of cheap renewables but high system costs. This is a graph from a study, it was actually a Google white paper from a couple of years ago that did kind of a thought experiment of an illustrative system with just wind and solar and storage, starting out with almost no wind and solar on the left side of the graph, and then gradually increasing the percentage of wind and solar and storage batteries up to 100%. And things are fine for a while as it's blended with other sources of gas or nuclear or whatever. But at some point, the system costs go nonlinear. And that is a problem, because if we're trying to keep costs affordable, keep political support for climate change policy, try to have people electrify their cars and their homes and their industry, you can't afford to have costs suddenly shoot up. Why exactly would costs shoot up? Well, it's called integration costs. It's because what do you do to cover that variability in output? One strategy is build really big transmission systems so you can aggregate the solar and wind over huge areas. Okay, that'll reduce variability to some extent. Load shifting. Got a lot of solar in the middle of the day. Let's have people run their appliances all in the middle of the day. Shift that demand to when the sun is shining. But load shifting is not without cost either. And you got to change human behavior. You have technology to do it. Storage. storage on a daily basis, seasonal basis, or to address that Dunkelflaute, that weather fluctuation. Batteries are not cheap. And right now we have lithium batteries providing 4 to 6 hours of storage, but not 12 hours, and not the storage that could cover 2 weeks of Dunkelflaute. So we're working on cheap long-term storage, but we're not there yet. But that's one of those things we should be developing. And some models also simply over-generate, meaning if your renewable output is lowest in the winter, build a system to meet demand there. Once you build that system, you're going to have a ton of extra renewable energy in the summer. Okay, well, maybe you can store it, maybe you can make hydrogen out of it, but all those things are costs that are not reflected just in looking at the standalone cost of that solar plant. To summarize, basically, as you get closer to 100% solar and wind, you're incurring capital costs that have to be spread over infrequent but very challenging periods. So this phenomenon is documented in a number of modeling studies, and I have several links down here. There is a dissenting view. I want to give credit to some modelers who rule out certain options, rule out nuclear, carbon capture and storage. They create and advocate for 100% renewable pathways. And so typically they include massive expansion of transmission, massive amounts of battery storage or thermal storage, building vast materials, water, molten salt, rocks underground that would store heat. They do throw in some hydro, some geothermal, some hydrogen turbines. These may be technically feasible, but we've never seen a power system like this. But I want to assure you that this is a minority of modelers, mostly in academia. You won't see governments or IEA or IPCC or IRENA put out these pathways. So I'm going to give the last word on this to our own National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL. 16 authors who are spending their careers advocating and promoting and developing renewable energy technologies. And their quote, which is worth pondering, is economically reducing overall US greenhouse gas emissions will likely involve very high, 80% or more, potentially maybe getting close to 100% renewable generation, while also focusing on decarbonizing other sectors or applying non-renewable low carbon resources such as CCS, carbon capture and storage, to the electric sector. Reducing the costs of low carbon generation electric sector potentially by keeping non-renewable options, CCS and nuclear, available, enables electrifying and thus decarbonizing other sectors, reducing our economy-wide emissions. So these are renewable advocates at our national lab saying, don't put all your chips on renewables. We need those complementary firm sources ready to come in. We don't know if they need to come in at 70% or 90% or 95%. That's still to be determined. But it would be risky not to develop them. Let me shift to that fourth strategy, carbon capture, and its role in getting us to net zero. Again, it's factual to say that mainstream modeling of how to get to net zero indicates a need for carbon capture and storage. Applied to emissions from power plants and industrial sources, most people think it's definitely needed for industry. Maybe we don't need it in the power sector, but the jury is out on that. And then we also need carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere. The graphic here illustrates the two ways I mentioned: forests and soils, farm practices. We call those the nature-based solutions. Planting trees, farm practices that can keep more CO2 in the soil. Very helpful with lots of co-benefits for the environment, but there are physical limits to how much you can do with that. The technological approaches The two that are most prominent right now are direct air capture and storage, or DACS, where you're literally sucking air into a facility and between membranes and catalysts and chemistry that I don't understand as a policy guy. You can extract the CO2, concentrate it, and inject it underground, or perhaps use it in small applications might be able to use some of it. The other option people talk about is bioenergy with CCS, growing dedicated plants that takes CO2 out of the atmosphere, combust them for industry or power plants, capture the CO2, and put it in safe geological formations. There's other things at the research stage too. Do we need this? Some environmentalists I'll turn to in a minute, don't like the whole idea of carbon capture. But let's go back to the IPCC analysis and the 4 illustrative pathways. One of them, P1, uses only nature-based solutions, uses no carbon capture of any kind. The P2, P3, P4 use both. They assume that P2, P3, P4 assume we're not going to be able to get on this incredibly steep emissions curve downward, and we're going to have to remove a lot of carbon dioxide removal. There is a dissenting view here too. If you want to go into detail, this summer, the Center for International Environmental Law put out a report that says confronting the myth of carbon-free fossil fuels, why carbon capture is not a solution. They say it doesn't work. They're wrong. We know how to do this. They say it's too expensive. Right now, it is kind of expensive, but compared to what is the right question? They say it's too risky. Yes, almost any industrial facility carries risks. Personally, I think that the risks of carbon capture, the pipelines, the injection are acceptable. The trickier argument is when they say it prolongs dependence on fossil fuels. They say if we develop this technology and start using it, somehow it is going to create sort of a moral hazard, and we won't be as aggressive on reducing fossil fuel use. I would beg to differ on that, on whether that should overcome the argument about not putting all your chips on just a couple technologies, but that's worth a debate. What's interesting, what the CIEL report does is they sort of embrace pathway 1 from the IPCC report, saying that the surest approach to avoiding climate catastrophe does not involve CCS, meaning the technological approaches. The emission pathway with the best chance of keeping warming at 1.5 makes no use of engineered carbon capture technologies. And this pathway involves a rapid phase out of fossil fuels, et cetera, just use reforestation. But when you look at the P1 type scenarios in the IPCC report, it requires global energy use to drop by 1/3 by 2030. Personally, I don't see that happening. Many mainstream modelers also say it would be nice if we could wave a wand and suddenly have global energy use drop by 1/3 in 10 years. But to count on that pathway as delivering us from climate change, I think is extremely risky. So that's my overall unifying metaphor. Should we place all of our chips on renewables? Should we say no nukes, shut down the existing ones, not develop an advanced generation of nuclear plants that are now being developed with passive safety systems, with good proliferation safeguards? Should we try to leave all fossil fuels in the ground? Should we not bring out any more natural gas to burn in a power plant with 100% capture? I think that's a risky bet if we're going to solve climate change. I think we should spread our chips on a bigger portfolio, deploying lots of solar and wind this decade. Absolutely. Deploying our lithium batteries while we develop longer term batteries, but also developing our options for advanced nuclear designs, carbon capture that can be used on power plants, industry, and eventually deployed to literally pull pull CO2 out of the air by mid-century. All these things take a long time to develop. The solar and wind industry did not suddenly appear overnight. Research stretches back to the 70s and 80s. Designs were perfected, technologies were perfected, and then we really went to scale over the last 10 years. Modular production, dropping costs. When we develop other technologies, we can't wait till 2030 to see if we need them. We need to develop options now that will take a decade or more of RD&D. So key messages: be extremely efficient in everything you do. Electrify everything, including making some hydrogen, ammonia, and other low carbon fuels. Produce mountains of zero carbon electricity. Build out the wind and solar aggressively while integration costs are still low. We're only at about 12% solar and wind right now. So we have lots of headroom before we get into that nonlinear part of the cost curve. Bring along the other technologies, viable nuclear CCS options, yes, and expand our transmission system to tap areas rich in wind and solar. Commercialize carbon capture technology, both for the removal task as well as for industry and electricity. Develop the capture, the pipelines, the injection sites, the governance, and the public acceptance. Spread your chips. We can also talk a little bit about global perspectives. I've talked a lot about sort of the what's happening in the US, but we need to think about the US is blessed with a lot of wind, a lot of solar, a lot of hydro. Not all countries have that. If you're Poland, you don't have a lot of sun, you're sitting on a lot of coal, and maybe you have a little bit of wind, and you don't have huge hydro. Also, let's think about what is even going to happen to US hydro resources. We produce about 7% of our power right now, clean, zero carbon hydro. What's happening to water supplies out west? Almost all of our big hydro is out west. Can we continue to count on that? These are some of the contingencies you have to think about and why you don't want to bet all your chips on just a couple of sources. And also, key message, I'll just turn political for 1 minute. Vote people in who will take on these challenges. We need the policy frameworks. And I haven't touched about policy. That's a whole nother lecture. That's next year. You know, people talk about carbon taxes, cap and trade, regulations. You know, there's a whole series of difficult choices there to make, but we need the political will to do it. And then there's a whole international dimension. No matter what the US does, it will not change climate change by itself. So we need to engage creatively and effectively with other countries. So I want to close this on one optimistic thought. I think many of you, of course, nearly all of you who are students, were born after the ozone hole was discovered in 1987. The nations of the world came together on a global commons problem and solved it. The ozone layer is now healing over your lifetimes. Now, it was an easier issue, but it had that global commons dimension. And yes, it cost some money to switch to the other chemicals, but we can do this if we have enlightened leaders who believe in science. So I'll stop there. I'm very happy to take some questions. Are you passing mics or I think you just yell it out. I think we're yes, sir.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming to Shippensburg, for letting us talk. It was a great presentation. I'm Karl from the biology department, but being in the building of business, I have kind of a couple of business questions for you. How do you reconcile net zero carbon with an economic paradigm that pushes continuous economic growth? Linked to that, for a second question, we should rethink the other paradigm, that capitalism free market in which the private sector controls pretty much the economy of the planet, is consistent with global approaches that will lead most likely toward public institutions to organize the appropriate response to the climate crisis.
Yeah, thanks. Excellent questions. And it's funny, I almost put in a slide at the beginning that talked about, can you solve climate change with capitalism? I personally believe that we can, and we probably don't really have a choice. You know, lecture number 3 in 2023 is capitalism and the environment. But I would give a short answer along the following lines. The alternatives to capitalism, if one thinks of socialism as meaning public ownership of all means of production, government control of all means of production, that has failed. We have multiple failures across the 20th century. That and those governments not only failed to deliver basic goods and services for their people, but they also were environmental bad actors. So by having public ownership of everything does not guarantee good environmental performance. If moving from capitalism to sort of European style socialism, which is really a mixed market of private business and a stronger public sector than say we have in the US, that to me looks like a viable solution. But read Naomi Klein's book, see what you agree, and I'll see you in 2023 to continue that discussion. Other questions? Yes, sir.
So, as a geologist, right, and I just flew back across the country to be here just in time to the talk. And I was in a conference yesterday where they were looking at how do we achieve the research that you're presenting in 10 years with the increase in demand for solar, particularly from the rare earth elements and the severe lack of those things. So we're all familiar here in Pennsylvania with our coal, our natural gas, of course, the Marcellus Shale. I sat in a talk yesterday where they're actually extracting right now rare earth elements for looking at the Marcellus to produce those for us, because in 5 to 6 years, we may actually run out of the rare earth elements that we need for photovoltaic and other new renewable technologies. So how do we reconcile the lack or the inaccessibility of the minerals that we're going to need to make that happen in the transition? And then the second part of that question, many of our students come from communities that's their primary livelihood, right? They're coal, oil, natural gas communities. What do we do and how do we affect our students in this 10-year paradigm and their families back home?
Yeah, a couple of really great threads there to pick up on. First of all, I'll say I'm not an expert at all in some of the mineral issues that you alluded to, but there are people thinking very hard about that. And so I think there's 2 threads. One is if we go full bore on just a couple of energy resources, are we going to hit some walls in terms of the rare earth metals? Say probably yes, which is another good reason, again, to diversify our resource base. The other thing I think that your question gets at is environmental impacts of energy production. And again, there's kind of this myth out there that solar and wind are zero carbon, and they don't have any environmental impact. And that is just wrong. All energy sources have some environmental impact, from the production of the materials to build them, to transporting those, to constructing, generating, and then life cycle. What do you do after the equipment's obsolete? So yeah, nuclear power has a nasty issue of what to do with the nuclear waste. I think it can be disposed of safely, not zero risk, but a manageable risk. Carbon capture, there is some risk of CO2 leakage from pipelines. If you're standing right next to it, you know, it's going to be unhealthy. But again, that risk is manageable. We move gas and oil and hydrogen through pipelines. And then there's even like visual impacts. We have people at the Jersey Shore protesting against the expansion of windmills because they don't want to see them offshore, or, you know, they're going to they're going to kill some birds, they're going to disturb mammal life. We have to find a way to manage these impacts because no energy source has zero impacts. Yes.
You talked about a fair bit about carbon capture and storage, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on some of the other more aggressive geoengineering solutions as a short-term fix for warming, or while we get these other issues ironed out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, this is not a specialty area for me, but I've skimmed it a little bit. The idea of geoengineering is kind of like the ultimate brick glass pull handle. If we cannot reduce our emissions fast enough, if we cannot pull CO2 out of the air fast enough, do we literally need to manage how much sunlight is hitting the earth to slow down warming? And there's a number of ideas for this. I mean, there are ideas about floating mirrors in space. There are ideas for injecting salt spray, injecting sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, creating giant phytoplankton blooms in the ocean. All these are very much just at a kind of a theoretical stage right now, and they will all carry risks too. I hope we don't have to go there, but I think it makes sense to at least study what our options might be. But again, we know that there's always a lot of unintended consequences of massive changes in the environment, in water and atmosphere, et cetera. But again, it's interesting here. Again, you see sort of a split where some in the environmental community would say, do not study those because the moral hazard that we might actually use them sometime. And then a more pragmatic element that says, you know, we're going to try our best to mitigate. We're going to try our best to do carbon dioxide removal as needed, but we may need to at least, have that option ready in the latter half of the century if we fail. Yes.
What are some things that students and student organizations should be focusing on right now to try to help improve especially in the carbon arena? We have signed on to our campus climate change agreement to try to help reduce the carbon that we use on campus, but we're wanting to get students more involved. What do you think are some ways that we can do that?
Yeah. Register people to vote, register people to vote, register people to vote. Students and young people in general still register and vote at much lower percentages than old guys like me. So I'm dead serious. We need elected leaders who understand science and will act on science. Coming down from that level, the kind of pledges that many universities are adopting under pressure and support from their students to buy, say, 100% of their electricity from renewable sources is good. It stimulates the market. But I would like to see, and some universities are hitting that target, but I would love to see some universities go beyond that to kind of to the next level of sophistication, again, like Google is doing. And I don't have a slide on this, but Google 24/7 clean power. Google understands that it's got a data center, like with a totally flat demand curve. In 24 hours, those machines just keep humming. And they buy a bunch of renewable power, a lot of it's solar. They know that at night, the electricity they're getting from the grid is not zero carbon. It's mixed in with some coal and gas. So they're finding ways to do buying strategies that really try to match their load with carbon-free power. So that's one of the next steps that a company, a city, or a university could do. 24/7 clean purchasing. The other thing is thinking over time Can we start to back out the use of gas or fuel oil for heating our buildings? Can we go deep geothermal heat? Can we switch to heat pumps over time? So thinking about, you don't want to necessarily rip out your boiler, your gas boiler this year, but what's its expected life? 20 years, 30 years? At what point should Shippensburg consider, as its capital stock turns over? And a university can also look at its vehicles too, and whether it can start, to what extent can it move to hybrid or all electric. So I hope those are some ideas. Yes. Repeat again.
You mentioned Naomi Klein.
Naomi Klein, yes.
I was just wondering what you thought of, what you think that was necessary.
Yeah. I have to first admit, I have not read the book. I have read accounts of the book, and I welcome big picture discussions on massive social change, massive economic change, and that should play out. Those should play out. I personally don't think that linking climate change to that inextricably is a good idea. I think we have we need to roll up our sleeves and just get going on climate, not say we can only work on climate if we change the whole economic system. And I would make one annotation of what I said earlier that addresses this gentleman's question as well. They're kind of related. Think about where innovation comes from. Innovation comes from capitalist economies. Look at what we did over the last year and a half. We invented vaccines for COVID, not only in world record time, but also with amazing effectiveness beyond the kind of 60–70% that a lot of our conventional vaccines did. That innovation springs from capitalism. And we need the same kind of innovation. It's the same innovation that has driven solar and wind costs down, that's going to produce the batteries, that's going to produce Tesla cars. So one of the beauties of capitalism is the innovation. One of the ugly sides of capitalism is if you turn it loose without public guidance, you get rivers catching on fire, which fortunately are largely behind us. But now we have a planet on fire. But it's not, I don't think it's because of capitalism, because Russia, China, India, Poland, they're all cranking out GHGs too. Anyone who hasn't had a question? Yeah.
If we fail to do anything about the carbon problem and the world kind of keeps going on where it is, what's it going to look like in 50 or 60 years?
For the latest on that, check out the IPCC impacts report coming out next year. It's not pretty. I'm not such a doomsayer that I think that cockroaches are going to take over the world, but life will become nasty, brutish, and short. In a lot of places, there will be very restricted water supplies, and people will go to war over water. Agricultural output will collapse in some areas that are now bread baskets, while Russia and Canada will be able to grow some more wheat. But the net effect is going to be terrible, I think, on overall agricultural output if we hit 3 degrees, 4 degrees centigrade later. It looks like if nations keep to their current commitments, maybe we can keep it at 3, but we need to strengthen those commitments and deploy the kind of technologies and measures that I've been talking about here.
We have maybe one last question from one of our remote attendees. Grace is asking specifically about hydrologic energy sources and citing some of the issues related to migratory salmonids and other wildlife. So on the one side, there's suggestions that we should remove dams to support wildlife. But if we go all out for hydroelectricity, what can we do to, essentially we don't want to hurt more wildlife in the process of going towards net zero. So how can we balance some of the pros and cons with something like hydroelectric?
Yeah, this raises just yet another nasty trade-off question. We have 7% carbon-free energy from hydro in this country because we have built huge dams and some areas just decimated salmon and migratory fish. Every once in a while, we take a small dam down and the fishery bounces back. There's a wonderful case study of this of the Elwha River in Oregon that I was actually involved in when I worked on Capitol Hill. It's a great success story. But I think one key thing is a huge portion worldwide of good hydro sites are already exploited, particularly in the US and other industrialized countries. So the idea that we're going to expand hydro a lot to solve this problem, we're not going there. If anything, we should be carefully looking at trade-offs on some of these existing plants. Would we be better off in general restoring some fish habitat and decreasing some of our hydro output? But again, keep your eye on the prize. We need to get down that giant toboggan slide of emissions. So the idea of taking dams out in a massive way or shutting down existing nuclear plants in a big way, like California is doing, keep an eye on California the next year or two. Their emissions are going to go up because the only way they can backfill the shutdown of Diablo Canyon is a significant increase in natural gas and even diesel burning for power. So,
All right. Well,
Thank you.
thank you again. You can see that Dr. Hausker has provided his email address, so I'm sure, bombard him with additional questions. He has said that we can release a recording of this video, so we will be putting that up on our social media sites when that's available. So thank you again for coming, and stay tuned for the next climate seminar. Oh, yeah. For you. Yeah, just a couple of Thank you so much.